The presidential transition is officially underway. But one thing is still missing. President Trump still has yet to formally concede. He acknowledged the transition on Twitter, only to quickly resurface false claims about election fraud. And while President Trump doesn't need to concede for a new administration to take over, it is highly unusual. But President Trump's voter fraud falsities are nothing new. In fact, many people saw it coming. Let's take a look.
So many cities are corrupt and voter fraud is very, very common.
That isn't a recent rally. It's from October 2016, when President Trump was then candidate Trump.
Voter fraud is all too common. And then they say, oh, there's no voter fraud in our country. There's no voter fraud.
But sentiments like this date back well before Trump's run for office. In 2012, he tweeted, quote, "Be careful of voter fraud." And on Election Day, he wrongly claimed polling machines switched votes from Romney to Obama. Sound familiar? In early 2016, after losing the Republican Iowa caucuses to Ted Cruz, Trump tweeted, "Ted Cruz didn't win Iowa. He stole it." But these unsubstantiated accusations continued even after the president's win in 2016.
What's going on with voter fraud is horrible. That's number one. Number two, I would have won the popular vote if I was campaigning for the popular vote.
Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 2.9 million votes that year. And early into his term, President Trump announced Vice President Pence would spearhead a commission investigating this alleged fraud.
This issue is very important to me because throughout the campaign and even after, people would come up to me and express their concerns about voter inconsistencies and irregularities which they saw.
To be clear, President Trump didn't just invent claims of voter fraud. They're nothing new from the Republican Party. Voter ID laws have been implemented mostly by GOP legislatures as a way to combat fraud, of which very little evidence has ever been presented. Still, in 2008, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Indiana's law, leading to a surge in stricter requirements across the country.
But what we're seeing is that for partisan gain, these laws are being passed that literally will block people from exercising their right to vote.
There's a new voter ID law that has just gone into effect here. You have to have this. The school has given this to students that because their student IDs will not work.
In the states where they do have voter ID laws, you've seen actually elections begin to change towards more conservative candidates.
Now, 36 states have some sort of voter ID law. All this despite calls from opponents that claim these more rigorous laws suppress the voting rights of the elderly and poor. So, back to Trump's commission in 2017. Well, it came up short. The White House disbanded it less than a year later, claiming states weren't cooperating. Ultimately, the group never produced evidence of widespread fraud, though it did lead to a probe by the Government Accountability Office of the commission itself. But that didn't stop the president from pushing these unfounded beliefs.
In many places, like California, the same person votes many times.
You got people voting that shouldn't be voting.
Mail ballots are a very dangerous thing for this country because they're cheaters.
The most important thing to know about voter fraud is that it's extremely rare. One study found only 10 examples of voter impersonation that could be prevented by voter ID laws over a 12-year period. Even the Conservative Heritage Foundation only found 1,300 instances of fraud since 1982. So we're talking thousands of cases across hundreds of millions of votes. Bottom line, it's just not a major problem in U.S. elections. This all brings us to today, with the president's legal team filing more than 40 lawsuits contesting election results.
It's a fraud, an absolute fraud.
But it's worth noting, by the lawyer's own admission, that many of these cases don't even address fraud. Instead, they talk about things like vote-by-mail deadlines and automated signature matching. And of the cases that do address fraud, the majority of them have either been dismissed or withdrawn. Even the Trump administration's own election security officials ultimately declared the 2020 election the most secure in history.
I do have confidence that the vote is secure, the count is secure, and the results will be secure.
Now, even though the president's claims don't carry any legal weight, they do come with some other consequences. One poll found 70% of Republican voters don't believe the 2020 election was free and fair. Another found 77% of Trump voters attributing Biden's win to fraud. As of now, only a handful of Republican leaders have publicly congratulated Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Others are staying silent.
Have you spoken to Vice President Biden yet?
I have not.
Do you believe he won the election?
And some have said President Trump has the right to investigate allegations of fraud or irregularities. So while the unfounded fear of voter fraud is nothing new, the tenor of these claims has surely accelerated.
The Senate back from its Thanksgiving recess with a list of things to knock out before the end of the year. Congress is trying to work out the details of its spending bill before government funding runs out on December 11th. Republicans and Democrats also under growing pressure to revive the stalled coronavirus relief talks, with several parts of the CARE Act set to expire at the end of December. NBC News correspondent Leanne Caldwell's on Capitol Hill. Leanne, let's start with COVID relief. What programs under the CARES Act are set to run out come late December?
Hey, Allison. Well, time is really of the essence because things are getting real. Up to 14 million people could lose their unemployment benefits, but the day after Christmas. That's because 2 unemployment programs are set to run out. One of them is one where gig workers and freelancers are able to access the jobless benefits program, something they couldn't do before this pandemic. Another is the unemployment program that allows people to get unemployment benefits for an additional 13 weeks beyond the 26 weeks that the states allow. So those are 2 big programs that are set to impact nearly 14 million people. But that's not it. There's a couple other things as well. The eviction moratorium is set to expire at the end of the month. The student loan forgiveness program for the time being is set to expire at the end of the month. And also there's a program of family paid leave, sick leave, for people who have to miss work because of COVID. The government will reimburse the employers for that program. That is set to expire at the end of the month, too. So there is a lot of pressure on Congress to act because a lot of people could be impacted if they don't do something, Allison.
Leanne, over the weekend, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called Majority Leader Mitch McConnell back to the COVID relief negotiating table, saying vaccine distribution is on the line. Here he is.
Vaccines don't cure illness. Shots in the arm cure illness. We need big relief. And among the relief we need, part of the HEROES bill, is the money to the states, once the vaccine is produced, to distribute it.
Leanne, Schumer's still pushing for the $2 trillion HEROES Act. McConnell wants a smaller plan. Any sign of a compromise or some common ground here?
Well, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell would also agree that there needs to be funding for a vaccine distribution. But again, they can't agree on the details of many issues. They're still far, far apart on the dollar amount. But Allison, there's a little bit of news today. There is a bipartisan group of Senate Republicans and Democrats who have convened their own negotiations. They have been speaking every day during the whole week of Thanksgiving, and those talks are continuing. And I'm told that they are making a lot of progress, especially on issues such as the Small Business Paycheck Protection Program, unemployment insurance, and exactly what Senator Schumer was talking about funding for a vaccine distribution program. Well, the thing is that going to go anywhere? Is that going to get the Democratic and Republican leaders on board to also be part of these negotiations? Well, the talks of these bipartisan senators are early, but they are still ongoing, and there are some major sticking points, and they're the same sticking points that the leaders had. Liability protection, which is what the Republicans want, and state and local money, which is what the Democrats want. But I'm told by sources that there is some hope that they can make some sort of progress this week, Allison.
All right, Leanne, we know December 11th is the deadline for Congress to prevent a government shutdown. Before Thanksgiving, the Appropriations Committees agreed on a $1.4 trillion price tag for a spending bill. Where do they stand on how that money will be spent?
They're still working on it, and as we speak at this moment, top leaders of those appropriations committees, the funding committees in the House and the Senate, are currently meeting to talk about that. The fact that the principals, the senators and the House members themselves are meeting, and it's not just staff, is a relatively good sign that they could be making lots of progress, that the staff made lots of progress over the weekend. But the rundown is that if they don't meet this December 11th deadline, that means the government will shut down. And so they are in a race until that deadline to try to get something done and passed both houses of Congress and signed into law by the president before midnight on that day, Allison.
Leanne, this week, Democrat Mark Kelly will be sworn in as the newest senator from Arizona. Republicans, of course, still have the majority in the Senate. But how could his arrival impact negotiations on the Hill?
Well, Republicans go from 53 senators to 52 senators, and every senator matters, especially when there is such a slim majority. We saw that just a couple weeks ago when Senate Republicans tried to push through a controversial nominee to the Federal Reserve Board named Judy Shelton. There's 3 Republicans who voted against her, and there was a couple senators who had COVID or were quarantining because of COVID, and so she failed. Well, with Mark Kelly being sworn in on Wednesday, that does not give Senate Republicans enough time, most likely, to bring up Judy Shelton, this controversial nominee, again. And it just also means that there's less margin of error for Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to get through legislation he wants, and most importantly, nominations that he wants to get through before Joe Biden becomes the president in January. Allison.
All right, Leanne, we'll see if that puts any pressure on negotiations, getting things moving along here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.